Dust swirled in the dying light, catching on the jagged edges of rusted iron. The air was dry enough to crack lips and split wood, yet the faint sound of rattling chains whispered from the back of the abandoned livestock pen. Flies buzzed lazily around the posts, but the real weight in the air came from the silence, thick, heavy, expectant. She was there. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, her dark hair matted with grit, her bare feet sunk into the hard-packed dirt. A length of chain ran from her wrists to a post sunk deep in the ground, as if someone feared the earth itself might carry her away if not anchored. Her eyes, sharp and still, didn't plead. They studied the horizon as though waiting for something, or someone. Somewhere in the distance a crow cried, and the sound made her flinch. Her lips moved, murmuring words in her native tongue, but the wind carried them away before they could be understood. The sun dipped lower, bathing the land in amber light, and for a moment the chain glinted like fire. That was when a shadow crossed the far end of the corral. Long, steady, purposeful. He came riding in slow, the kind of pace that told everyone he wasn't in a hurry to please them. The stranger's horse was coated in a thin veil of dust, the same color as his coat and the brim of the hat that shaded his eyes. He had the look of a man who'd been too many places and trusted too few. The town of Red Bluff didn't take kindly to strangers, especially ones who didn't speak much. He felt the weight of their stares from the saloon windows and the blacksmith's porch. Somewhere, a poker game stopped mid-hand. But he hadn't come for whiskey or work. He'd come because he'd heard a story, half-whispered in a trading post 2 towns back, about a girl left to rot behind a cattle pen on the edge of town. They said she was Apache, that she'd been caught stealing horses, that no one cared if she lived or died. He didn't believe all of it. He didn't need to. When he finally saw the pen from the hill, he stopped his horse. The chain on her wrists caught the last of the sun, sending a flash of light across the dirt. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Before the week was out, someone in Red Bluff was going to get buried. Stick around. This is the story of a man who should have kept riding, but didn't. The sun rose hard over Red Bluff, burning away the cool night air and baking the street until the dust curled in little spirals. The stranger rode in without hurry, his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning every face without seeming to. The town was nothing more than a strip of buildings, saloon, general store, blacksmith, sheriff's office, and the emptiness between them felt as wide as the desert beyond. He could tell right away it wasn't a place for welcome. A pair of men leaned against the hitching rail outside the saloon, their spurs catching the light. They didn't speak, but one tilted his head in a way that made it clear he'd noticed the rifle tied to the stranger's saddle. The other squinted, as if trying to place him in some memory. The stranger kept his eyes forward. In towns like this, eye contact was either an invitation or a challenge, and he wasn't offering either. He dismounted in front of the general store, tying his horse loosely to the post. Inside, the air smelled of old flour and tobacco. The storekeeper, a thin man with a long mustache, barely looked up from stacking cans. "We don't get many riders from the north," he said flatly, eyes dropping to the dust on the stranger's boots. The words weren't a greeting, they were a probe. "Just passing through," the stranger replied, his voice even. He bought a small sack of beans, a coil of rope, and a tin of coffee, paying with coins dulled by age. As he turned to leave, the storekeeper finally looked at him fully. "If you're smart, you'll keep moving," he said. "There's nothing here worth finding." The stranger stepped outside, the warning echoing in his mind. He'd heard the same thing in too many towns, usually from men who didn't want their secrets disturbed. Across the street, the sheriff stood on the boardwalk, a broad man with a belly pushing against his vest. He chewed slowly on a toothpick, watching the newcomer like a man assessing a stray dog. Near the far end of town, just beyond the last building, he saw it. A fenced pen leaning with age, its posts splintered, its gate barely holding together. And inside, chained to one of those posts, sat the girl from the story. Even from a distance, the sight of her was jarring. She wasn't slumped in defeat. She was upright, alert, her gaze fixed on him as though she'd been expecting him all along. The stranger turned toward the saloon instead, feeling the weight of her stare on his back. Inside, the room was dim, the smell of whiskey and sweat thick in the air. A card game was underway in the corner, the players pausing just long enough to mark his entrance. He ordered a drink and took it to a table by the window, positioning himself so he could see the street and the pen. A barmaid with tired eyes came over, her smile polite but guarded. "Ain't seen you before," she said, setting the glass down. "Don't plan on staying," he answered, taking a slow sip. She glanced out the window, following his line of sight. Her mouth tightened. That girl out there, best not to get curious. Folks here have a way of handling their own. He didn't answer, but his hand tightened slightly around the glass. In the street, two men passed by the pen without so much as a glance. The girl didn't move, didn't call out. She simply kept her eyes locked on the saloon window, and he knew she could see him just as clearly as he saw her. When he finished his drink, he stepped outside, leaning casually against the post as though enjoying the morning. But his gaze drifted down the street, to the girl once more. Something about her stillness unnerved him. It wasn't resignation, it was patience, the patience of someone who had already decided how this would end. He knew then that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as riding out the way he came. In towns like Red Bluff, trouble had a way of finding a man who went looking for it, and though he hadn't come here for her, the sight of those chains had already made his choice for him. The stranger waited until the heat ripened and the town's attention wilted. By noon, Red Bluff folded into its own shade. Men drifted indoors, shutters pinched the light, and the street thinned to empty. He filled a canteen at the horse trough, then walked the long way around the buildings, taking alleys of bent fences and stacked crates until the pen came into view from behind. He stopped first, listening. The flies had that lazy, circling mutter. Somewhere, a windmill creaked. No voices. Still, he studied the dust for boot tracks, counted 3 sizes, one dragging in the heel, and noted fresh scuffs near the gate. Someone had checked on her not long ago. He came forward careful, hat brim low, hands visible. The girl turned before he said a word, the chain at her wrists giving a tired clink. Up close, she looked younger and older at the same time. Skin sunburned at the edges, a cut mended wrong on her lip, eyes that didn't wander. She watched his hands first, then his boots, then his face, and when he knelt by the post, she shifted weight like a sprinter waiting for the gun. He set the canteen down where she could see it and stepped back, offering distance like a pledge. She didn't reach for the water right away. Her gaze slid past him, checking the gaps between boards, the slice of street beyond, the angle of the saloon roof where a rifle could hide. Only when she seemed certain they were alone did she crouch, test the slack in the chain, and pull the canteen in with her heel. She drank hard and short, stopped, breathed, drank again. The sound of it, in a place that had no mercy, landed heavier than any sermon. He let her finish before he spoke. "I'm not with them," he said, keeping his voice low. She blinked once, as if filing the sentence in a drawer she might open later. He tried a second line, simpler. "I can help." A flicker, something wary and curious, touched her face and vanished. She answered in her language, a ribbon of syllables carried on a dry wind. He didn't recognize the words, but he recognized the cadence. A question sharpened to a point. He spread his hands, palm out. "Not sheriff," he said, then made a cutting motion across the badge stitched on his own coat's inside pocket. A ragged scar there, more habit than symbol. Her eyes tracked the gesture, then lifted to his with a steadiness that felt like a weight. He studied the chain where it met the post. The iron was old, but not weak. The padlock newer, the kind sold in the general store with the long mustache behind the counter. He tested the hasp with his fingers and felt her flinch at the scrape of metal. "Easy," he murmured. He pointed at the lock, then at his saddle knife, then made a spiraling gesture that meant time. She understood enough to tug once at the links and shake her head. Not now, not loud. Her lips formed a single sound, almost a breath. He caught only the shape of it. Later, he would think it was a name. Bootsteps cut through the quiet, casual and cruel. The stranger straightened and stepped away from the post, like a man who'd come to examine the fence and found it wanting. Two men rounded the corner with the kind of confidence that grew where laws bent. The first wore a sweat-stained hat and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. The second held a short shotgun tucked in the crook of his arm like a sleeping dog. "Afternoon," the grinning one said, looking the stranger over as if pricing him. "Sheriff's got business with anyone nosing around the pen. You lost, friend." The stranger kept his breath even. "Looking for a horse trader," he lied easily. "Heard he kept stock out this way." The grinning man's eyes slid to the girl and back. "Only stock here's spoken for." He nodded at the chain. "She's a thief, Apache raider. Tried to lift a mare off Mr. Delaney's lot. Sheriff says we hold her till the owners get their say. Maybe teach her some manners." The way he lingered on the last word did the teaching. The shotgun man chewed on a sliver of wood, bored and dangerous. "Move along," he said. "Road's that direction." The stranger met their gaze one at a time, the way you handle spooked horses. He shifted his weight like he was about to obey, but let his eyes rest on the lock 2 beats too long. The grinning man noticed. "Don't," he said softly, and the softness was more honest than the grin. "You look like a fella with sense. Keep it." The shotgun tilted a degree. The stranger tipped his hat, the gesture buying seconds, then turned and walked away without hurry. He didn't feel their eyes on his back. He knew they were there. He counted steps to the corner, then rounded it and breathed again. He took the second alley to a stacked lumber yard, climbed the outer ladder to the mill platform, and watched the pen through a cut of slats. The men stayed a while, one talking, one laughing, both throwing words meant to bruise. The girl gave them nothing, her stillness a kind of refusal. Eventually, they left in the direction of the saloon, shouldered by the town's heat. The stranger followed the line of their route in his mind, mapped the angles, the blind spots, the places where a man could wait without being seen. Plans began to draw themselves thin as pencil on raw wood. At the livery, he found what he needed to finish the picture. A broken hacksaw blade in a bucket of bent nails, a wedge of tallow, a length of burlap. He paid the boy, sweeping the floor for a handful of old horseshoe nails, and watched the way the kid glanced toward the street before taking the coins. Fear had rhythms here, and even the young had learned the tune. Back at his horse, he cut the saw blade to a palm length, wrapped it in burlap, and tucked it under his shirt where ribs met belt. Night work then, quiet work. If it failed, a different kind. He returned to the pen near sunset, walking the long arc that let the sky hide him. The girl saw him first. He paused at the fence, eyes on her hands, and she raised them slightly, showing him the link nearest the lock. A thin line of rust had eaten into one side. Not enough for fingers, enough for patience. He let the burlap bundle show between his fingers, then shook his head. Not yet. He touched 2 fingers to his eyes, then traced the air. 3 posts, the gate, the corner shadow, so she would know what he knew. Her mouth softened at the corners, the closest thing to trust he'd seen. The bell over the saloon door clanged, and voices spilled into the street. Laughter, a hard kind. The stranger slid back from the fence and melted into the last stripe of shade. Sheriff's silhouette blocked the doorway a moment later, heavy and sure. He looked toward the pen like a man checking the time, then spat into the dust and turned to talk with the grinning man from earlier. The shotgun leaned in the doorway behind them like punctuation. The stranger studied their positions, the way the sheriff's hand rested without thinking on the butt of his revolver, the way the grinning man's eyes drifted, always looking for purchase. When the dark finally pulled a lid over Red Bluff, the wind changed and carried the smell of sage and old rain. He moved. The world narrowed to breath, boards, iron. He slipped the burlap-wrapped blade between link and lock, greased by tallow, and worked it like a prayer. The girl kept her hands still, muscles trembling not from fear, but from refusing to betray effort. A dog barked twice and went silent. Dice clattered somewhere far, far away. The blade bit, snagged, sang a note only metal knows. He froze, counted, cut again. Sweat ran into his eyes and tasted like old pennies. A footstep scratched at the corner. He translated the sound, drunk, alone, or careful. The rhythm chose careful. He slid the blade away and moved his hand to the girl's shoulder, pressing once. Still, she became stone. A shadow leaned against the fence 2 posts down, breathing with a mouth that had smoked too much. A match flared, then died. The man muttered to himself about the night and the heat and the boredom of guarding other men's cruelty. He drifted on. The stranger resumed, slow as erosion, until the rust surrendered with a sigh disguised as wind. The chains slackened just enough. Not freedom, not yet. He eased the link so they wouldn't speak, then wrapped the cut in burlap and tallow to look whole by moonlight. He put the saw away and met her eyes. Tomorrow, his hand said. Dawn. She nodded once, then turned her face toward the dark horizon, where the desert waited like a test. He stepped back into shadow, felt the town breathing its sour sleep, and understood what the day had carved into him. The difference between passing through and staying is often one person in chains. He settled beside his horse, closed his eyes without sleeping, and began counting the heartbeats until first light. The sky over Red Bluff broke in pale blue streaks, the kind that didn't promise mercy. The stranger had been awake long before the first rooster call, listening to the rhythm of the town's sleep. He knew how early the baker stoked his oven, how the blacksmith's hammer rang twice before settling into its day's work, and exactly when the sheriff's men traded shifts. Timing was the only weapon he had, and timing could be sharper than steel. He led his horse behind the livery, checking the packs one last time. Canteen full, rope coiled tight, a small pouch of jerky. The burlap-wrapped chain link was in his saddlebag, a reminder that their window for escape was small and brittle. If they were caught, he didn't finish the thought. He'd been in enough tight corners to know when the end was a bullet, a rope, or something worse. When the sun was barely a coin above the horizon, he approached the pen from the long side, using the leaning shadows of the buildings for cover. The girl was already watching him, her gaze steady, almost impatient. In the cold blue of morning, she looked different, less like a prisoner, more like someone standing at the edge of a race. He knelt by the post without speaking. The burlap came off the chain, revealing the thin scar of his cut from the night before. With 2 twists of his hands, the weakened link bent enough for her to pull free. She didn't hesitate. The moment the chain slid off, she was on her feet, scanning every angle like a tracker reading the ground. He passed her the rope, motioning for her to wrap it around her wrists loosely, making it appear she was still bound if seen from a distance. It was a small trick, but in a town like this, seconds meant everything. They moved together toward the rear fence, where 2 slats had rotted enough to give way under pressure. She slipped through first, her feet silent in the dust, then waited while he followed. Beyond the fence lay a narrow gully choked with sagebrush, the perfect place to disappear for a moment. But moments were fragile. A shout cut across the street, sharp as a whip crack. Not the sheriff, one of his men, the grinning one from before. The stranger didn't look back, but he heard the hitch in the man's voice, the sound of someone realizing what was missing. "Sheriff!" The word carried like a gunshot. The girl tensed, but the stranger grabbed her arm and pulled her into the gully, moving fast but low. They reached the far end of the wash and scrambled up the slope, the dirt giving way under their boots. From the crest, the desert spread wide, a skin of gold and shadow. His horse was tethered to a lone mesquite just ahead, stamping its hooves at the scent of urgency. They mounted quickly. He swung into the saddle first, then pulled her up behind him. Her grip on his coat was firm, and when he kicked the horse into a run, she didn't look back. The first rifle crack split the air before they'd cleared the ridge. Dust spat up near the horse's flank, and he urged the animal harder, cutting a diagonal path through the sage to throw off aim. The girl leaned into him, her breath quick, her voice a whisper in his ear, words he didn't understand. But the tone was enough. Faster. By the time they hit the dry riverbed, 3 riders had broken from the town, the sheriff among them. He recognized the man's broad shape even from a distance, the way he leaned forward in the saddle like the hunt was personal. They would have good horses, fresh ones. He needed to make them doubt the chase. He reined left, following the riverbed until it narrowed between 2 cliffs. The walls rose high, offering shade and danger in equal measure. Sound carried here. Every hoofbeat echoed like thunder. He slowed just enough to listen for the second echo. Their pursuers were closing. Halfway through the canyon, he spotted what he needed, a rockfall hanging loose above a bend. He steered the horse to the side, passed the girl the reins, and slid to the ground without breaking stride. She looked back, eyes questioning, but he only motioned for her to keep going. With a few swift movements, he jammed a wedge of stone under the hanging mass. A good strike in the right place might buy them the minutes they needed. He pulled his revolver, aimed not at a man, but at the wedge, and fired. The crack of stone giving way was louder than the shot. A curtain of rock and dust poured down, sealing the bend behind him just as the first of the sheriff's riders appeared. The echo swallowed their curses. He sprinted after the girl, catching the horse at a run. Swinging back into the saddle, he didn't waste words. They rode hard until the canyon spat them into open desert, where the horizon was a lie, always far, never closer. By mid-morning, the sun had teeth. The girl pointed toward the distant rise of land, where the earth rippled with heat. He trusted her instinct and turned that way, knowing she'd read the land better than any compass. The pursuers would have to circle the canyon, losing time. It wasn't enough to be free, but it was enough to think about what came next. When they finally stopped in the thin shade of a rock outcrop, the girl slid down first, walking a few paces away before turning to him. She touched her chest lightly, then said a word, 2 syllables, careful and strong. It took him a moment to realize it was her name. He nodded, repeating it as best he could. Then he gave her his own. The desert was still, but somewhere behind them, trouble was moving. He could feel it in the air. This was no rescue neatly done. This was the start of something the whole town of Red Bluff would bleed to end. And he knew, looking at the line of her shoulders as she scanned the horizon, that he wouldn't walk away from it. The heat was the kind that made the air dance, warping the horizon into shimmering mirages. By midday, even the rocks seemed to hum. The stranger kept the pace steady but deliberate, knowing that a sprint across open desert would burn the horse out long before safety. Behind them, somewhere beyond the ridges, he could almost feel the sheriff's determination, thick, heavy, closing. The girl, now riding in front of him for a clearer view, scanned the land like a hawk. Every so often she'd point, sometimes to a cluster of rocks that could serve as cover, sometimes to faint trails etched into the sand by long-forgotten hooves. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was with short, decisive words, as if time itself could be wasted on syllables. They stopped in the shadow of a boulder, the size of a wagon, the horse breathing hard. The stranger poured a trickle of water into his palm for the animal, then took a sip himself before handing the canteen to her. She drank sparingly, wiping the dust from her lips with the back of her hand. For a moment there was a kind of silence between them, not empty, but heavy with the knowledge that this pause wouldn't last. The crack of a rifle broke that silence. A bullet kicked up dust inches from the girl's foot. The stranger was already moving, yanking her back into the saddle and driving the horse into a hard run. He didn't bother looking over his shoulder. The echo of hooves was close enough to feel through the ground. They cut toward a dry wash, hoping the uneven terrain would slow the riders behind them. The girl gripped the saddle horn, her braid whipping over her shoulder. while the stranger leaned low over the horse's neck. The wash twisted left and right, a ribbon of shadow in the glaring light, until a sharp rise forced them up and out onto a plateau of flat, open ground. It was the worst kind of place, nowhere to hide, nowhere to turn. The sheriff's men fanned out behind them, 4 riders now, dust boiling up in their wake. The stranger counted the distance, too far for a clean shot, too close to ignore. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, passed the reins to the girl, and turned in the saddle. The first shot dropped a rider's hat clean off, sending the man swearing and ducking low. The second sent another horse skidding sideways in panic, buying them a few precious seconds. They angled toward a jagged line of cliffs where the rock broke into narrow gullies. If they could reach them, the pursuers would have to come single file, evening the odds. But the cliffs were still a long ride away, and the sheriff was relentless. By the time they reached the first outcropping, another shot rang out, this one clipping the stranger's sleeve. The fabric tore, but the bullet missed flesh. He slid off the horse, shoving the reins into the girl's hands. "Up there," he ordered, pointing to a ledge that overlooked the gully entrance. She hesitated only a moment before climbing, nimble as a cat despite the fatigue. The stranger crouched behind a boulder at the gully mouth, rifle ready. The first rider rounded the bend, too fast to stop. The stranger's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. His horse bolted, scattering dust and panic into the line behind. The sheriff's voice carried through the chaos. "You can't keep her, stranger. She's ours by law." There was no fear in the tone, only a cold certainty. The stranger's reply was a single shot into the dirt at the sheriff's horse's hooves. The animal reared, forcing the sheriff to pull hard on the reins. In the brief standstill that followed, the stranger heard the girl above him, shifting stones along the ledge. A moment later, a small rock slide tumbled down, forcing the remaining riders to pull back. It wasn't enough to end the chase, but it was enough to make them think. The sheriff called out again, his voice edged with frustration. "You don't know what you're getting into. She's not worth dying for." The stranger glanced up at the girl, her eyes bright even in the shadow. She didn't need to speak. The answer was already written in her stare. He chambered another round. "That's where you're wrong," he said, loud enough to carry. They moved fast after that, using the gullies to weave through the cliffs until the sun began to dip, bleeding gold into the stone. The echoes of pursuit grew fainter, though never disappearing entirely. The sheriff wasn't a man to give up easy. When they finally broke free of the cliffs, the desert stretched wide again, this time with a distant shimmer that promised water, or at least the hope of it. The girl pointed, her voice low but certain. The stranger nodded, setting their course toward that fragile promise. Night would come soon, and with it the sheriff, but for now they had bought themselves one more breath of freedom. Dawn broke with a pale light that painted the desert in muted golds and grays. The air was cool, but the stranger knew it wouldn't last. He had chosen the campsite carefully, nestled between 2 ridges with a small spring trickling from a crack in the rock. The horse grazed quietly, ears twitching at every distant sound. The girl sat cross-legged near the water, braiding her hair with deliberate, unhurried movements. She had slept little. Her eyes carried the watchfulness of someone who expected trouble. The stranger had spent the night listening, measuring the silence, waiting for it to break. It finally did, just after the first sliver of sun touched the ridge. The sound was faint at first, the rhythmic thud of hooves, the creak of saddle leather. They had been found. He stood, checking his rifle, then scanned the ridgeline. The sheriff's riders appeared one by one, dark shapes against the growing light. At their center rode the sheriff himself, broad and solid, his presence as heavy as the iron badge on his chest. There would be no running now. The terrain around the spring was open, and the riders had them surrounded. The girl rose, eyes locked on the approaching men. The stranger stepped in front of her, the rifle loose in his hands, but ready. The sheriff reined in his horse a dozen yards away, dust curling around his boots as he dismounted. "You've made this harder than it had to be," the sheriff said, his voice carrying easily in the morning stillness. "Hand her over and you can ride out alive. Keep her and I'll see you both buried before sundown." The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "She's not yours to take." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "By the law of this territory, she is. Apache raiders killed good men last year. This one was caught stealing from a ranch that's paid me plenty to protect it. That chain was mercy." The girl stepped forward, speaking in her language. Her tone was sharp, her words clipped like a knife carving wood. The sheriff sneered, clearly understanding enough to take offense. "She's lying," he spat. "Her people raid, burn, kill. You think you're saving her, but you're just bringing more of them down on us." The stranger's grip on the rifle tightened. "Maybe I don't care about your side of the story," he said, stepping closer. "What I care about is that I've seen chains before. Seen what men do when they think the law's just a word they can twist." One of the riders shifted in his saddle, muttering, "We gonna talk him to death or shoot him?" The sheriff raised a hand, keeping them still. His eyes stayed on the stranger. Last chance. The moment hung between them, brittle as glass. Then the sheriff's hand dropped to his revolver. The stranger moved first. His rifle barked, the shot slamming into the dirt near the sheriff's boots, close enough to stagger the man back. The girl bolted sideways toward the ridge, drawing the eyes of two riders. The stranger used the distraction to fire again, this time hitting the leg of one rider's horse, sending the animal rearing and the man tumbling into the dust. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the morning air, bullets whining off the rocks. The stranger dove for cover behind the spring's boulder, firing in measured bursts. The girl scrambled up the ridge, disappearing behind a lip of stone. Two riders tried to flank the stranger, but he dropped one with a clean shot and forced the other back with a near miss. The sheriff advanced in the chaos, revolver in hand. The stranger stepped out from cover just as the sheriff raised his gun. They fired almost together, the sheriff's shot grazing the stranger's arm, the stranger's bullet tearing into the sheriff's shoulder. The force spun the lawman sideways, his revolver slipping from his grip. Before anyone could move, a cry rang out from above. The girl appeared on the ridge, holding a large stone in both hands. She hurled it with all her strength, the rock smashing into the ground at the hooves of the nearest rider. The startled horse bolted, colliding with another mount, and the confusion rippled through the group. The stranger seized the opening. He advanced on the sheriff, kicking the revolver away and leveling his rifle. "It's over," he said, his voice low but carrying. The sheriff glared up at him, pain and pride warring in his eyes. "You'll be hunted for this," he said through clenched teeth. "Then I'll keep riding," the stranger replied. He backed away, rifle still aimed, until he reached his horse. The girl was already beside it, breathless but steady. They mounted together, and without another word, the stranger turned the horse toward the open desert. The riders didn't follow. Whether it was loyalty to the sheriff or fear of what the stranger might do next, they stayed frozen in place as the pair rode into the rising sun. Hours later, when the heat returned and the spring was nothing but a memory, the girl looked over her shoulder. Red Bluff was far behind now, just a smudge against the endless horizon. She touched the stranger's arm lightly, then spoke his name. He glanced at her, and for the first time since this began, he allowed himself the faintest smile. They were free, for now, and in the west, for now was as much as anyone could ever ask. The desert swallowed their trail as the sun climbed higher, each mile putting more distance between them and the weight of Red Bluff. The wind carried only the scent of sage now, no trace of gunpowder or dust churned by pursuit. The stranger rode in silence, his eyes on the wavering horizon, knowing that freedom in these lands was never more than a breath away from being taken. The girl sat behind him, her hands resting lightly at his sides. She didn't speak, but the tension in her shoulders had eased. Once, she glanced upward, her gaze tracing the flight of a hawk riding the warm currents. For the first time, she looked not like someone escaping chains, but like someone choosing her own path. When they stopped at a narrow rise, the stranger let her take the lead. She climbed to the top, standing against the vast sweep of sky, her hair pulled by the wind. He watched her for a long moment, memorizing the sight, not as the girl he'd found in the pen, but as the woman walking into her own future. Without a word, they turned toward the horizon. In the west, that was the truest kind of promise. No destination, only the road ahead.